Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by Ipono Maui and ED Care. Ipono Maui is led by internationally renowned expert on eating disorders, Dr. Anita Johnston. Located in a home-like oceanfront facility in beautiful Maui, Hawaii, Ipono offers residential, partial hospitalization, and intensive outpatient treatment for eating disorders. Visit iponomaui.com, spelled AIPONOMAUI, to learn more. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861. Carmen Cool, MA, LPC, is a psychotherapist, educator, speaker, and cupcake connoisseur. In addition to being a therapist for 17 years, she has started and run a nonprofit, created youth programs, and speaks internationally on health at every size, feminism and eating disorders, and weight stigma. Her work is focused on dismantling diet culture, healing our relationship to food and body, and supporting the next generation of body-positive leaders. She is currently the board president of the Association for Size Diversity and Health and was named Most Inspiring Individual in Boulder, Colorado, and was the recipient of the Excellence in Eating Disorder Advocacy Award in Washington, D.C. Carmen is a psychotherapist and advocate for liberating our bodies from the tyranny we put on them. She works primarily with binge eating disorder and chronic dieting. She brings a strong feminist perspective and is rooted in the health at every size approach. Please welcome Carmen. Carmen, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for asking. I'm happy to talk to you this morning.
I am so excited to have you here. First of all, I'm very excited about the 2 things that we're going to kind of focus on today, which are binge eating disorder, because we haven't had a specific episode on the podcast yet about binge eating disorder. I've kind of talked pretty broadly about all the different types of eating disorders. And then also to have a really amazing discussion with you, who you're so qualified and the best person to talk with about this, size diversity and weight discrimination, and just kind of getting into all of that too. So I'm pumped.
Great, I'm excited.
Yeah. So I always start off with my guest asking them a little bit about their background and how they came into the eating disorder field.
Yeah. So I came in to the eating disorder field probably largely out of my own personal experience of having and recovering from an eating disorder, and then also having a sister who died from an eating disorder. So I feel like those are probably the things that led me here.
Yeah, it's very significant things. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your own journey in recovery?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I always struggle a little bit with knowing how far back to go.
Oh, sure. I guess, yeah, wherever, and we'll just figure it out.
When I was 2, no, I'm kidding. I feel like a broad picture might be grew up in diet and culture, right? Kind of was indoctrinated into that culture pretty early.
Me too.
By the other women in my life, which, it was what we did back then. It's what we did together. And both my sister and I, probably we were in bigger bodies as kids. And so there was this like weight loss focus that was in the house, but nothing that really got too intense until maybe right before I started college. I'd lost a lot of weight, actually. And as is often the case when you lose a lot of weight through a diet, I started getting all kinds of compliments. And that really just kind of took off, and I wanted more, and I wanted to be able to say I had reached this goal that I had set for myself. And what I should kind of bring the camera back out here a little bit to say is that I was also really, I don't know that I knew this then, actually, but in a binge eating pattern. Mm-hmm. So there was a way that food was my source of comfort. Food was my thing that I went to whenever I was having an uncomfortable feeling, and food was also just frankly something that I loved. And there was a way that I was probably very much in a binging and overeating pattern, but I don't know that I could have named that until college, when it really got severe, or extreme, rather. It got pretty extreme. And so at the time I thought that the thing to do was what a lot of us think is to do, which is to go on a diet, and that will solve the problem.
Right.
And of course it didn't. But what I will say is that when weight loss occurred and I had the desire to keep that going, then it was an easy slide for me into bulimia for a while. Mm-hmm. And then ended up needing to drop out of school for a semester and went into inpatient treatment to do the healing and recovery work for that. And that was about 28 years ago. So it's been quite a while.
Wow. Congratulations. I think that that's amazing. And I always pause people on it when they share things like that on the podcast, because there are people who are going to listen to this who really need to hear that you've been 28 years recovered.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Amazing.
Thank you. And then I'll also share that alongside of that, my sister was kind of across all of the forms of eating disorders, I'm sure, over time. But she started when she was 12. I think that's when it really took off for her. And she, I think it was maybe 12 years ago that she died from anorexia. So there was a lot of stuff going on around this in my family. And I think where my interest particularly landed was around this intersection of weight stigma and eating disorders. And I know some people would argue with me, but while my sister died from anorexia, I could certainly say that it was weight stigma that killed her. So I think, that place of, the places where those things intersect was what got my attention. And then when I came to school to be a therapist, from the beginning, I knew this was the work that I wanted to do.
That's wonderful. I think that that's such an amazing path that you've had. And I'm really lucky that you are able to be this wonderful leader in our field. I'm really grateful to you. And I'm sorry about these really painful experiences personally and with your family. I can't imagine with your sister.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. It certainly was a messy and complicated relationship.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so tell us a little bit about how you started to get interested in this idea of weight stigma and how that intersects with eating disorders, because I'm very interested in it myself. And I think that this is an area where our field has a lot of work and growing to do. And it's one of my favorite things to talk with people who are not professionals about as well, just how weight stigma affects so much of our lives.
And there's so much I can say about it. But I think how I got interested in it was really when I was in treatment. And the therapist that I had, the person who ran the treatment center I was in, was starting to speak about these things. She was starting to write and teach and lecture on stigma and the way stigma is showing up in our society, and the ways that we treat fatness and fat people were really contributing to the problem, and the ways that we were solving social problems in operating rooms. And so I kind of got, in a way I could say, I kind of got radicalized by her.
Well, thank goodness.
In the best ways possible. I was like, oh my God. So I think she started to really broaden my thinking around, this isn't just an individual issue that people are having, that there's a bigger thing at play here. And so I think she ignited my curiosity and my passion and my interest in it.
Absolutely. So I guess for people who are, a lot of this might be kind of asking what your ideas of the different definitions are, just to give some people who are listening more language. And I certainly am not an expert. I always just try to be really humble and know that I'm still learning, and language is always changing too. So how would you kind of define weight stigma? Like, what is it exactly?
It's a good question. I will also say that I am I'm a perpetual student as well. So I certainly don't feel like I have the definitive answer on anything.
Sure.
But one definition or one idea of weight stigma that I think works for me is that it's kind of negative weight-related attitudes and beliefs that show up as stereotypes and rejection and prejudice and discrimination toward people at the higher end of the weight spectrum.
Yeah. And also, what are some of the most respectful terms that we can use to talk about people in larger bodies?
Great question. Thanks for asking that. So everybody's going to be different around this question. I can tell you what I don't use, and I don't use the word overweight ever because I think it implies some norm that we're either above or below or right at, and I kind of think that's a mythical idea. And every time I hear the word overweight in my mind, I'm thinking, over what weight? Like,
me too. And I'm always thinking of the BMI chart.
Yeah, right. We could
that
say a
horrible,
lot about that.
I know, right?
So I don't use the word overweight, and I don't use the word obese because that's just an awful word, and it's a medicalized word that describes a body size. So those don't feel worthwhile to me. I think depending on who I'm talking to, I will either use the word fat. I'll just reclaim the word fat as a neutral description of my body, a body type. Sometimes I'll use the word higher weight, right? People in higher weight bodies. Kind of, it really depends on where I am. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel similarly that, it's different for every person. I think it's helpful to ask and to just be in tune with who you're speaking with, individually or as an audience. And also just recognizing, just like you did, that it's just complicated and the terminology around it isn't easy. And some things feel good to people and some things do not. So tell us a little bit about how maybe weight stigma affected you throughout your recovery.
I feel like weight stigma in general creates kind of a hostile recovery environment. And I think it's really hard for people to do the hard work of recovery without acknowledging that the ways that we treat and think about fatness, I think we have to acknowledge that. And I think we have to build in resilience around that or stigma resistance or, skills for dealing with a fat phobic culture. I think it's really hard to recover when we treat higher weight bodies so horribly. I call myself my body size has changed up and down over the years, like they do in response to life and in response to all kinds of things. But I've not been in a body that has elicited a lot of direct experiences of discrimination and prejudice. So if I call myself fat, I'm going to be on the smaller end of the fat spectrum because I do benefit from some privilege, even though I'm higher than average, and higher than the norm, and higher than what doctors tell me I should be. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, totally. I was actually just going to ask you to just real quick, let's bring up the term thin privilege too, because I think that's important to acknowledge. Like, so for people who aren't familiar with this idea, what would you say thin privilege is?
That there are privileges that people in thinner bodies or not fat bodies get in the world just simply from nature of the body that they're in. So it's kind of like white privilege, right? I have privileges in the world because I have white skin, or people in thinner bodies get privileges that other people don't. So that can look like walking into a store and knowing that there's going to be clothes that will fit me.
Right.
Or, sitting in a chair and knowing that it's going to be a chair that can hold me.
Right.
Or going to the doctor and knowing that there's going to be a blood pressure cuff that can fit my arm. Those kinds of things that I think we just, and unless we're really learn to be aware, we take for granted. Knowing that if I apply for a job and go on a job interview, the reason I don't get the job is likely not going to be related to my weight. Those are examples of how thin privilege can work in the world.
Right. So it's really complex, right? That it's, I think to me, it's obvious that we're treated differently based on how other people perceive our bodies, be that more in line with the thin ideal or not in line with the thin ideal. Tell us a little bit about kind of some of the ways that you've noticed this can get in the way of recovery for people.
Okay. That's a big question too.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm thinking of like one of the examples I think of with my clients is just a lot of my clients hate having to go to the doctor because they know that they are going to get, or they anticipate and are very often correct in anticipating a lecture on their health and being scared about their weight. And really, they just need to go to the doctor to get a prescription or to get their annual checkup or to get their pap smear done. And they weren't asking for any of that.
Yeah, it's really hard to learn how to advocate for ourselves and our bodies in the medical community. So I think doctors, right, nurses, it can certainly show up there. The culture at large, right, when there's a general disdain for fatness. Really, then if my body needs to change as a result of recovery, that gets really complicated and hard to do. Even in mental health professionals, weight stigma can show up, right? That we grow up in this culture too, and I think we're certainly not immune from stigmatizing attitudes. So there's I think for some people, if they're recovering and coming out of a weight that's too low for them, there's an idea that yes, you need to gain weight, but not too much weight. Right? There's a way we're trying to help people recover into the right size body, and I think that's damaging.
I do too. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like what kind of the idea of the right size body is sometimes in the medical profession or even in the recovery profession?
A not fat body.
A not fat body,
right?
yeah.
And I mean, really, I think that's what we think of it as.
Yeah. And I would also say, I've noticed a lot of fear of fat in specific places as well. Is specifically belly fat. And I think that that's really damaging too. We're all shaped really just differently. And I don't think people should have to be fearful of their bodies. Yeah.
Totally. Or this idea that it's okay to be in a bigger body, but as long as it's proportioned right.
Right. Right.
There's just, so many ways bodies come.
I know. It's always interested me and also appalled me just how we became so anti-fat as a culture. I just don't understand it. Maybe tell us a little bit about some of your experiences, like noticing how our culture can be really anti-fat.
I feel like that's everywhere. I went to the doctor to get a mammogram, actually, and it was interesting to me that I opened the cupboard to get one of the gowns, and there were two columns, right, two stacks of gowns, and one said regular, and the other one said extra large. I was like, and right there it is, right? Right there it is. This idea that extra large is somehow not regular or normal, right? That it was separated out as something else. So I think the messages are actually everywhere that we need to be careful about being too fat. I mean, I think it comes from the government. I think it comes from the doctors. I think it comes from Oprah. I think it comes from friends and family. It comes from all the images that we get shown. I mean, in some ways, it's like, where don't we find that idea?
Yeah, and it always breaks my heart when I'm working with somebody or know somebody personally who is in a larger body and they don't trust their health, even though there's no indication that they are unhealthy in any way or have any sort of health problems going on. And it's only the weight that makes them worry about that. It really does upset me.
Yeah. Well, because we've been told for so long that quote unquote overweight, I always use that word with quotes.
Yeah.
Your quotes, right? Quote unquote overweight is unhealthy. Right? But the actual data shows that people in that overweight category actually live longer. Right? There's a way that this weight and health, the way that those two get so conflated, has people really freaked out and scared rather than, so for me, I remember there was a time definitely in the overweight category, would go to the doctor, they would do my labs, they would do all of the workup and say, you are the perfect picture of health. You should go lose weight. I was like, well, you can't, wait, what? Like, you can't even tie that to anything wrong with my health status. Like, that's about something else altogether. I think there really is a way that, and that's what the Health at Every Size movement is saying, is that, gosh, it's about just taking the best possible care we can of the bodies that we have and not trying to, people do a lot of unhealthy things in the name of health. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that that's a really good intro to talking about thin privilege and this is also all of this conversation today. Nobody needs to go into a shame spiral over this. Oh my gosh, please listen with so much compassion. If you are in what's considered a quote thinner body, no need to feel bad or beat yourself up for any of this, but you could do things that are a lot more, I guess, unhealthy and people are not going to bring it up with you as much. So there are people who are at much lower weights who are really not looking out for their health and not taking good care of their health, and they're not going to have the same experience when they go to a doctor or a therapist or a dietitian. And that's really unfair, and that's what that privilege is, I think.
Exactly. No one's going to look at the ice cream in their cart and say anything to them.
Yeah.
Right? But someone in a fatter body could get looks or comments, actually, if they have ice cream in theirs.
Yeah. And actually, I would definitely, I mean, I recommended before, but for our listeners, just recommend you should pick up Health at Every Size and read it with your therapist, because there might be some stuff in there that you're not ready to read. But in general, I think that that's a really, really helpful book. And one of the research studies that Dr. Linda Bacon, who wrote Health at Every Size, the book, cites is that people who are in fatter bodies actually usually eat the same or less than people who are in smaller bodies. And that it's just that prejudice that kind of keeps our eyes watching everybody.
Exactly. We don't know anything about how somebody eats or moves or lives based only on the size of their body, but we think we do. Right?
Yeah. I just think I also think it's a really weird pattern that we feel like we can police other people's health.
Right?
Like, what if you were going through a period in your life where you're like, yeah, I'm not really being healthy. Like, for example, me in graduate school, just keeping my head above water. Right. I think I would feel really terrible and shamed if people were, checking in on my every eating and sleep habit that I possibly had.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I definitely think that health has kind of become glorified and moralized, and it's a way to judge other people. Oh, yes. Tell us about healthism. What is healthism?
Healthism. That's what we're talking about. The way that, we elevate people who are healthy or who are doing everything to pursue health as somehow better. Pursuing health is this ultimate thing that we should all be engaged in. And then kind of the way that shakes down is that we think worthiness goes along with that people who are healthy or are more worthy than people who are not. I don't know. There's so much I could say about it. It's kind of super frustrating, actually, this idea of people, whether they're healthy or not, all deserve dignity and access and respect. And we don't have to be healthy in order to be worthy of those things. Mm-hmm. And everybody gets to determine for themselves, actually, how much they want to prioritize health. And there are people for whom they will never fit inside a definition of health because of their bodies for some reason, whether it's a chronic illness or whether that it's a disability, that we've gotten so narrow in our definition of health that, there's so much morality that gets overlaid on top of that.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think about how there can be a little bit of self-righteousness for people who, I guess, eat in quote healthy ways or exercise a lot or exercise in specific ways. It just makes me think of when people are really athletic and we know that they eat lots of fruits and veggies, how that just gets so much attention and praise and reward, really, and lots and lots of positive feedback. And that's fine if that's the way that you want to live your life. That's absolutely okay. But it does feel strange to me that is so rewarded, whereas other things are not rewarded in the same way. We're not necessarily walking around always talking about, I'm thinking of an interaction with some extended family where people were talking about all the things that they were doing to prioritize their health in what they felt were healthy ways, like eating in specific ways and exercising in specific ways. And nobody was out there, and everybody was all excited about all the different things these different people were doing. And it seemed like a big deal. But really, what we weren't talking about were other things that are really valuable to me, like how are we being of service to other people? How are we doing charity and mercy and helping community? And it just seems like health, and more specifically, it's thinness, I think, because we know health and thinness are not the same thing, is always the trump card. And it just frustrates me.
Yeah, it's super frustrating. Yeah. It's super frustrating. I've stopped even using the word health a lot of the time just because it's gotten so complicated around what it means. And I kind of do a lot of work with people to redefine what health means for them and what it looks like for them.
Yeah.
and what well-being looks like for them.
Yeah. What are some things that we can start to think about, in terms of health or maybe well-being that don't have anything to do with our weight or pursuing thinness?
I mean, what else goes into determining health?
Yeah. How can we help some of the people who are going to listen to this redefine that too?
Oh gosh. So health is so much bigger than what we eat and what we weigh and how we may or may not exercise, right? That other things can include social support, adequate and restful sleep, access to quality care, medical care, a work life that's meaningful and satisfying. And then there's the broader social determinants of health, right? Or the social things that impact our health. Like, are we physically safe? Do we have a clean environment? Are we subject to stigma and discrimination? And I think those things, poverty, prejudice, discrimination, oppression, those
racism,
racism, right? That they have a stronger impact on our health than if we're eating enough vegetables.
Yeah.
We don't focus there very much.
Yeah, it's so much bigger. And I don't think that just like you said, we don't focus there hardly at all. And that's why I definitely, when I talk with my clients about this and we talk about size discrimination or weight stigma, I always talk to them about how I really do think that it's about thinness and our culture's fat phobia and prejudice and pressure for thinness, because otherwise what we would be doing is we would all be walking around policing each other about how much sleep we're getting.
Right.
Because sleep is much more predictive of overall health outcomes than is diet. But nobody's asking you, did you get your 8 hours? Were they restful? Did you put your phone away and do your good sleep hygiene? Nobody's asking you that. But people are talking about their weight all the time.
Yep. True story.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how can we start to build some resilience for trying to recover in this culture that is not recovered, that is totally fat phobic and diet crazy?
Oh, how do we start to take back kind of our own sovereignty, right, if you will, of our own bodies and our own choices? And, I think of it a lot as, how do I come home? How do I land inside of this body and just be a really good caretaker of it, right? How do I learn to be more and more attuned and connected to my impulses and my desires and my needs and my limits, and then being responsive to those things, right? And then learning to recognize and name oppression for what it is. And how do I want to take action around that also? I think that sometimes activism can be super important in terms of recovery and healing. How do I want to help create a world that doesn't oppress people around what they look like,
It seems like it should be basic, but it is not.
It is not at all basic. It's not just, related to size, of course, but I think, oh gosh, how we start to do this is starting to change how we see things, right? So I think Anita Johnston said this at some point. It's not about how I look, it's about how I see. How am I seeing myself? How am I seeing other people? How am I in relationship to this culture that wants to make me feel really horrible so that it can sell me solutions? And if I'm trying to solve a problem by getting my body to be a certain way, how else can I find to solve that problem? Right? Because thinness isn't going to bring me what it promises. It's just not. It's an illusion. So if what I want, and I think it is what we all want, whenever we say we want to be thinner or lose weight, we're saying we want acceptance and we want love and we want belonging. And how can I get those? How can I get those needs met without having to take on my body as a project,
Yeah, I feel like our bodies get scapegoated.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. And I also feel like connecting back with your body can be so rewarding and just a rich experience, because sometimes I think we think of ourselves, or I'm certainly guilty of this, as I'm basically a brain walking around and, what another author I listened to, a meat suit, and I'm not just a brain. I mean, all of this is all interacting, and my body is part of me too.
Yeah.
They're not these separate things. It's not just like, oh, this is a space where I hang out. Like it's all connected. Right.
Yeah, my body's the reason I can be here, actually.
Yeah.
Right? It's the reason I'm on the earth. And, also wanting to say that there are many reasons why somebody might be not connected to their body or might not want to be connected to their body. So,
sure.
We have to find pathways back that feel okay, and ways that we can begin to learn to trust our own bodies. And so for me, I know that there will be, like, my work is about embodiment, right? And then there'll be days that I notice I haven't gotten up from my computer in 6 hours. Like, that's
right.
Really, I just find a way to ignore the fact that my shoulders are up at my ears,
right.
or like, wow, I've had to pee for an hour and I haven't let myself, take care of that. Like, there's lots of ways we try to override what our bodies need.
Sure. For me, the first step in connecting with my body and just, I guess we could even separate it from just connecting with your body and just say learning to be a good caretaker for my body was to just decide, all right, I'm just not going to be mean to it today. That was the first baby step for me, was like, I'm just not going to be mean to my body today. And that was kind of like my little intro. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear how you help people to start to learn how to caretake their body, whatever shape and size it may be.
To not be so mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of think about it as this question of, regarding food, if we want to talk about food, like, if I knew that anything that I ate wasn't going to affect my weight or health, what would be the thing I really wanted?
That's an excellent question.
Just to start to tune into what are my desires? What do I want? What brings me pleasure? Oh, a lot of work around pleasure and satisfaction. What's satisfying? And that letting that be a part of our decision making. What's going to feel really satisfying? So do some work around that.
So whenever I'm working with people or talking on the podcast or in emails with people about the idea that pleasure is really important in eating, a lot of the times I get a response like people just are really scared and shocked by that idea. But what's going to happen if I indulge this desire to have pleasure from my eating? Like, can I just eat these blah, 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 quote, healthy foods and stick to this like rigid plan of that? And then, of course, I'm going to like make myself impervious to all bad things that could ever happen to my physical being, like never get disease and live a long life or whatever. Yeah, just thinking about that reaction of like people just don't believe that. Why do you think pleasure is really important to bring back to how we eat?
Oh my gosh. I feel like I have a lot of feelings about this, as you can tell from the tone of my voice.
Feels are allowed.
I mean, in a way, I'm stunned by the question, right? Like, why would I ever want pleasure to be gone? Oh my gosh. Okay, so there was this study I heard about, or an experiment, where they had some women from Europe and some women from the States, and they flashed up a picture of a chocolate cake and asked each group to say the first word that came to their mind. And the women from Europe, their first word was celebration when they saw the cake. And the American women, the first word was guilt. And so I was so struck by that, right? That we've lost a lot of time, or we've become afraid of pleasure, and like afraid of our appetites, afraid of our desires, afraid we're going to be too much somehow, somewhere. But I think pleasure is important because that's what's part of satisfaction, right? If I can get full on a meal full of green beans. Let's just say all I ate was a whole bunch of green beans. I could be full. I might even get stuffed, but no part of me is going to feel satisfied, right? And so sometimes we find a way to eat until we feel satisfied. And so I feel like that has to be part of the equation. Like, I've just learned how to eat for both, I get my need for nutrients met and I get my need for pleasure met. I don't want to have to sacrifice one for the other. There was an article I read, and I can't tell you who wrote it now, but there was a quote that said, refusal of joy is the unhealthiest habit.
Ooh.
Isn't that good?
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Man, I'm going to be thinking on that for a while. It also kind of brings me back to a little bit earlier in our conversation where I really think that our culture has developed this weird way of linking up denying pleasure and being moral or acting good and right and well. And when I was at the IADEP symposium, Sandra Kronberg was talking about how she believes that our fixation with health and being rigid and righteous about health is kind of the new way that people are doing what they used to do with religion to prove that we are good and to, prove that we are worthy to kind of just act all of that out. And I think that when you embrace pleasure as a really important part of your eating, you may get some pushback from some people around you, because I don't think that in general, this whole healthism way of eating lines up with allowing for space to have pleasure in what you eat.
Yeah. It makes me so sad.
Me too. I remember in the early days of my recovery from anorexia, going through starting to eat my fear foods, and all of them, of course, were delicious. And I love them. I love them all now. And I remember after I had finally gotten to this point where I was like, all right, I'm just going to do a recovery because I am so beaten down by my eating disorder and dieting that I am at rock bottom. I humble myself to whatever I need to do. And in eating those things that I had thought of as incredibly scary for years, that I wouldn't allow myself to have, or would allow myself to have in very small amounts, or I don't know, according to rules, without having those limitations on them, just being able to rediscover the food and remembering like, oh my God, actually ice cream is totally delicious to me. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
How does getting satisfaction work in terms of recovering from binge eating disorder? Because I know a lot of the people that I work with just kind of will talk about how they feel like they're eating and looking for something in that food. I think they're trying to get an emotional need met in the food. And to me, it always sounds like, oh, there's some missing satisfaction. And I always am wondering, oh, is there pleasure that's being left out of this too?
That's an interesting question. I feel, oh gosh, there's many ways I could go with that, actually. I think there's two ways that binging shows up. It's probably much more than that, actually. But when I think about it, there's the kind of binging that's in reaction to deprivation or restriction. Yeah. And then the kind where it's about, I need help managing my emotional experience, and food is the thing that works the best.
Yes.
So in the first way, I feel like that's where I do bring satisfaction work in a lot, because there's a way that the binging is in reaction to not being allowed something. And so I think that's where the fear shows up, that if I allow myself to have this thing that I want, let's say chocolate, I'm going to eat chocolate forever, ever, never stop. Right? And that's the fear. And the fear gets confirmed because when they allow chocolate in, that is what happens. Right? And for a while, it's like, see, I told you I couldn't be trusted. Look what I did. Right. Where it's actually the restriction that's the issue, not the chocolate. And so it's kind of healing the dieting mindset. Healing that part needs to happen. And until we really trust that I can have chocolate, that I have full permission to go after what I want, then I don't have to eat it for days because it's always going to be there. And then also this idea of slowing the binging down and really being present for it. I can certainly remember many experiences where I was eating food that I thought I would have told you that I loved, but I never remembered having it. And I certainly don't ever remember savoring it. Right. Definitely. Did you ever see the movie What About Bob?
Yes, a long time ago.
Yeah. So I love using this example. There's a scene in there. You can actually YouTube the dinner scene from the movie What About Bob, where he shows up for dinner and they're eating fried chicken. And he, after every bite of food that Bob eats, he is like losing his mind. He's like, right? He is vocalizing and enjoying and savoring every bite of food that he puts into his body. I'm like, man, that's how I want to eat. That's what I want my food to do more times than not. Right. So kind of slowing down and saying, enjoying the experience of the food. I think Michelle May said this once, like, we say we love food so much and that's why we're binging, but we're not present for any of it. So it's not really loving food. Because if I really want to be present and enjoy and be with the experience of eating this thing that I love. Is this getting to what we were talking about?
Yeah, I think that I just think it's one of the really sad things about the diet mentality is that it robs us of being able to feel completely comfortable with feeling like food is pleasurable too. Because I think that in the diet mentality, you're not allowed to think of food as pleasurable, and that it's just a very utilitarian way of looking at food. And that's so disconnected. And yeah, like you said earlier, like I don't want to live my life without feeling pleasure and satisfaction and being able to savor delicious foods.
Right?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I know. It's one of like the most fun things we can do. And I do think it's really connecting, especially when we do that because of a particular celebration or culture or ritual. And that's important too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When I think of birthdays, right, and I think of birthday cake, that's about celebration. It gets out of treating our bodies as a machine.
Mm-hmm.
There's a poet that I read, and there's a line that she says, like, I want to occupy my body like it's Mardi Gras.
That's awesome.
Like, that is my highest aspiration right now, you know?
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about your work with ASDA and what ASDA is.
ASDA is the Association for Size Diversity in Health, and it is a group of teachers, educators, activists, professionals, advocates who come together and who are doing the work. I'm hesitating because it's in a little bit of a shift right now in some ways, but doing health at every size work in the world. And so we offer support to each other. There's a listserv where we ask questions, where we deconstruct the data to understand it better, whether we give support, learn, grow, all of that stuff. It's kind of a professional membership. It's a membership organization right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the things that you've learned from your work with ASDA?
Oh, I've learned, I'm the current president of ASDA. I've been president for the past 2 years. So for that period of time, I've done a lot of learning about leadership, actually. But in the organization itself, also a deep learning curve around intersectionality and the way that ASDA has been focused on eliminating weight stigma, but hasn't done so well until lately at really looking at the fact that we can't pull weight stigma out as a separate form of oppression because it's connected to everything else. So I've done a lot more learning around anti-oppression work, actually, as a result of doing this work in ASDA, which has been really great.
Yeah, I'm still just kind of like processing through how, yes, it is connected to everything else. And I think that that's great to be able to look at it through that intersectional kind of lens and look at it with so much more depth, which can be a little bit tricky.
Yeah, it's a big thing to look at.
Yeah. For our listeners out there who maybe are experiencing oppression in some form or specifically because of the type of body that they have, what are some things that we can do or some practices we can start to help us be resilient in a culture that's really unkind to different bodies?
Big question. It's an important question. The first thing that just popped into my mind is the importance of finding community. I don't think it's on us individually to heal, right? I don't even know that we can. I think we need community to do that.
Yeah.
So that really is the first thing that comes up. A community committed to thinking differently about bodies and weight and health and being inclusive and open. So that's one thing that comes up.
Absolutely, because I think otherwise you can wind up feeling like you want to do this radical, amazing overhaul thing and nobody else around you is doing it.
It's exhausting to be going against the grain all the time. It's just really tired to hold a counter view to the current way of thinking.
Absolutely.
We can start to question ourselves. It can just feel like we're on guard all the time. It can be really fatiguing. So having a place of other people who really get it by itself can be relieving. And then the support, of course, becomes really invaluable.
Yeah. For me, one of the things that I have to practice myself and try to teach other people is the role of self-compassion and really thinking about how can we continue to cultivate more compassion for our bodies, whatever they are like, because there just isn't compassion for all bodies in the broader culture at large. So, one of the examples that I use with my clients too is I have an autoimmune disease and there are certain points in time where I need to take a specific medication to manage that. And there have been times where I've taken that medication and one of the side effects is weight gain. So in those times, I'm faced with a choice, right? And I always want to be a good caretaker to my body. That's what I work toward. And so I can either go along with weight stigma, healthism, diet culture, and think that there's a problem with that weight gain and hate my body and be mad at it. Or I can approach that with compassion and know that my body is just reacting to having a medication in it that it needed, and to know that the weight actually doesn't really mean anything to me.
Right. Your body was not better before than it was, than it is now.
Right.
Those are just, our bodies are going to change, and to be able to kind of develop some ability to be flexible and fluid around that, that
totally
our bodies are going to change through our whole lives. I'm 50, almost 52, and my body is doing things it's never done before. And I'm, fascinated on some level, well, that's interesting. And, just approaching my body with some kind of reverence and curiosity, and just isn't it fascinating what bodies can do? And my body is going to be in a state of change from now until I leave my body. Right. And that if I'm only acceptable at one certain place, then I'm pretty vulnerable,
Right. Absolutely. I think that that's a really good example to use too, that I use sometimes when talking to people is, if we don't look at body acceptance and body appreciation on the domain of weight and shape and size, if we shift it over to looking at it with age, we just know our bodies change. Gravity happens, and we're all going to look different as we age and go through our lives, which also is not incredibly supported. And
I was just going to say.
Yeah, especially for women. But I do think that people can recognize a little bit more of how we don't have total control over that process with aging, and we don't have total control over the shape and size of our bodies either. And even more important, we don't even need to control it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
We're good as is.
Yeah. Right.
So in kind of wrapping up, I wanted to just loop back around to binge eating disorder specifically, because this is one of your areas of expertise, and I know that you are passionate about it. And I just wanted to talk briefly about, in these last couple minutes, about what do you think some of the main misconceptions about binge eating disorder are?
I think there's a misconception that anyone who's in a fat body automatically has binge eating disorder.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
a big one, which isn't accurate. I think people don't understand that I tend to think of binge eating as much more of a problem around restriction than it is a problem around binging a lot of the time. Not all the time, but I think that's a misconception. So we tend to ignore the restricting part. Right. And even if that's just in the mindset, right, that we have to go after that diet mentality, and the restriction is not the pathway out of binge eating.
Right. It makes it worse.
Long shot. Yeah, guaranteed.
Yes.
Guaranteed. The other, let's see, what's another misconception or myth around it?
Another one that comes to mind for me is how people who are at lower weights or smaller sizes also have binge eating disorder. People of all sizes have binge eating disorder.
Yeah, we can't tell by looking at someone, again, what their experiences are or what's happening. I think we do a real disservice. I think it's really harmful, actually, that we don't recognize that someone in a higher weight body can actually be starving, and someone in a lower weight body can actually be struggling with binging. That those kind of disordered eating and eating disorders happen all across the spectrum. Thinking that we can tie a diagnosis to a body size actually is just our prejudice. So I think that's something that we all need to look out for as well. Whether that's clinicians, right, working with people coming in, or any of us looking at certain bodies and imagining we think we know what they're struggling with.
Carmen, thank you so much for being here with us and talking us through all these really complex issues which deserve ongoing discussion. Of course, this is just kind of the beginning of the conversation that we'll continue to have, throughout the life of the podcast. Where can people go if they want to learn more about you?
They can go to my website, which is carmencool.com. and it's in the process of being revised right now, but that would be the place to find me.
Great. And I will, of course, link that in the show notes like I always do.
Great. And I just want to thank you so much for inviting me on and for asking such great questions and just being such a resource in your community as well, in our community. I'm just really grateful to be able to have this conversation with you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm honored to have you on. Anytime you want to come back, Carmen, I would be thrilled to talk with you again. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.